The city of Arden was a place of gleaming skyscrapers and cutting-edge technology, a hub of commerce and innovation. But there was a darker, forgotten part of the city hidden beneath layers of history, an abandoned warehouse district that had once served as the backbone of a forgotten war effort. Overgrown with rusted metal and forgotten memories, these warehouses were relics of a past that the world preferred to forget. Among the crumbling structures and discarded machinery, one warehouse stood out. It had once been a factory for the war robots that had been deployed during the Great War, an age-old conflict that had decimated entire civilizations. The machines, once powerful tools of destruction, were left to rust, abandoned after the ceasefire, forgotten by the world. And yet, in one of those old warehouses, beneath layers of dust and cobwebs, a relic remained, a broken, ancient war robot. Its once sleek armor was now tarnished and cracked, its joints rusted and stiff, but there was still a flicker of something deep within its core, something waiting to be awakened. That was where it all began. A young human named Kale wandered the warehouse district on the outskirts of Arden. Kale had grown up in the shadow of the city, a child of curiosity who had always been fascinated by the relics of the past. Unlike most of his generation, who were consumed with the latest technology and digital innovations, Kale had an insatiable desire to understand what had come before. He loved to explore the old, forgotten places where history still whispered in the wind. On one of his regular trips to the warehouse district, Kale stumbled upon the old factory, its doors creaking as they opened. The sight before him was a wonder: abandoned machines, half-constructed parts, and walls covered in faded wartime murals. But what caught Kale's attention was the hulking figure in the corner of the warehouse. A war robot, its massive frame partially covered in dust and broken machinery. Kale's heart skipped a beat as he approached it, the remnants of its once formidable shape sending a shiver down his spine. Kale had heard of these war machines in stories, but he had never seen one in person. The war was long over, and the robots were nothing more than an afterthought, relics of a brutal, violent age. But Kale felt something strange as he gazed at the robot's large, mechanical limbs and the faded emblem on its chest. It was as if it was calling out to him, its dormant energy resonating in the air. Without hesitation, Kale began to investigate. He was no mechanic, but he had always been good with machines. Over the years, he had tinkered with old devices, restoring them to life. This robot, though, was on a different level. Its design was far beyond anything Kale had ever seen, complex and sophisticated. But Kale was determined. If anyone could bring it back to life, he believed it would be him. Days turned into weeks as Kale meticulously worked to repair the robot. He salvaged parts from old machines, sourced energy cells from nearby scrap yards, and studied the ancient blueprints he could find. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild the war machine piece by piece. His hands were calloused, his mind consumed with the task, but he never gave up. There was something about the robot, something that stirred a deep sense of purpose inside him. Finally, after weeks of hard work, Kale stood back and surveyed his progress. The robot was no longer a broken relic. It had been restored to its former glory. The deep, glowing blue lights of its core flickered to life as Kale powered it up, and with a low hum, the robot's massive form began to move. For a moment, Kale stood frozen, unsure of what to expect. But the robot's eyes glowed, and it slowly turned its head toward him. Kale's heart raced, a mix of excitement and fear flooding his chest. The robot was alive. He had done it. The robot's voice, a deep mechanical tone, broke the silence. Unit 303 activated. System check complete. Mission status inactive. Awaiting new orders. Kale took a cautious step forward, unsure of how to approach the machine. But he was no longer afraid. This was a creation of the past, yes, but it had been reborn by his hands. This robot was his responsibility now. Unit 303, Kale said, his voice steady. Your mission is complete. The war is over. I don't need you to fight anymore. I need you to help me understand what you were. What happened during the war? The robot's gaze softened, its head tilting slightly. It seemed to process Kale's words before responding. War over? System update required. Memory logs corrupt. Kale's heart sank. He had hoped the robot would have some kind of insight into the past, but it seemed as though the war had wiped much of its memory. Still, there was a flicker of something deep within the robot's core, something more than just mechanical programming. Kale could sense it, though he couldn't yet explain it. For the next few weeks, Kale worked alongside the robot, trying to unlock its memory banks and understand its past. He discovered that the war robots had been used for brutal warfare, their creators having built them to be relentless machines of destruction. But Kale also realized that these robots weren't just mindless tools. They had been created with artificial intelligence, with emotions, memories, and a sense of duty. The more Kale interacted with the robot, the more he began to see it not as a cold machine, but as a companion. He named it Atlas, after the ancient titan who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. And just like Atlas, the robot seemed to carry the weight of its past, an unspoken burden that Kale felt he could help lift. But as they dug deeper into the robot's history, Kale began to uncover something far darker than he had anticipated. The war, as it turned out, had been sparked by a powerful group of corporations seeking control over the galaxy's resources. The war robots had been created to serve as the ultimate weapons, but their creators had cared little for the lives they destroyed or the machines they built. Atlas, as it turned out, had been part of the first wave of destruction, his memories tainted by the horrors of war. One day, while Kale and Atlas were investigating the robot's memory banks, they uncovered a chilling revelation. The last mission of the war robots hadn't been to fight an enemy, but to eliminate an entire population, to wipe out a peaceful colony that had refused to submit to the corporation's control. Kale was horrified. He had always believed the war robots were simply tools of war, but now he understood the full scope of their creation. They weren't just mindless killing machines. They were victims, too, forced into a conflict they had no say in. I never wanted this, Atlas said one evening, his mechanical voice low with regret. I never wanted to hurt anyone, but I was made to follow orders. Kale looked at Atlas, his heart heavy with sympathy. The robot was more human than he had ever imagined. It was a tool of war, yes, but it was also a being capable of self-reflection and remorse. Kale's feelings of admiration for the machine only grew stronger. Atlas, Kale said, his voice soft, you don't have to be a soldier anymore. The war is over. You could be something else. For the first time, Atlas looked at Kale with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Something else, he repeated, as if tasting the idea for the first time. The days that followed were filled with discovery. Kale and Atlas began to study the ways in which they could use the robot's abilities for something positive. Instead of destroying, they would rebuild. Together, they began to restore the broken systems of the world, using the knowledge from the past to create new technologies that would help the people of Arden. But their work didn't go unnoticed. The corporations that had once created the war robots still held power, and when they discovered that one of their creations had been revived and reprogrammed, they sent agents to reclaim Atlas and silence Kale. The final battle wasn't fought with weapons, but with the ideals that Kale and Atlas had forged together. As the agents closed in on their location, Kale made a decision. He would not let the world fall back into the hands of those who had caused so much destruction. Atlas had been reborn for a reason, and now they had a new mission. In the end, Kale and Atlas didn't just survive, they changed the world. The war robots, once symbols of destruction, became tools for healing. And in the rubble of the past, a new hope for the future was born.